Okay, welcome everybody, wherever you are, in the spirit of today's talk and the projective disturbances. I am zooming from Nashville, from the one and only Parthenon that you see in the background. I don't think Aris will discuss it, but I'm hoping as the real Parthenon was to Freud. So let us begin then. I'm specifically having this particular image because it also was built around the time that Freud visited Greece in 1904. The Nashville Parthenon was built in 1898, though the version we have today was a rebuilding of the original in Nashville in 1925. So even that Parthenon has its own strange history. So today's, before we start today's talk, I'd like to announce our next talk, which is on April 6th. The talk will be given by Elizabeth Prodromou from Tufts University. And we have a fairly topical talk in April. It's on Russian Orthodox soft-sharp power, influence building and disruption in Greece. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. It will also be on Zoom. But today's talk, the title is The Parthenon, Projective Disturbances from Freud and Le Corbusier to Scully and Kahn, autobiographically. I also would like to say that if you have any questions or comments, please include them in the chat and the Q&A, and I will pass them on to the speaker at the end of the talk. So let me present our talk today, our speaker today. We're very happy to have Aristotelis Dimitrakopoulos with us today. He's actually spending the whole semester here at Yale, and Yale is also part of his academic training because he has done his master's here. So let me just give you a brief summary of his work. Aristotelis is an architect, an urban designer, an educator, a design consultant, a critic, and a researcher with a 22-year professional and academic experience in multiple countries and regions, working with international firms, consulting for public and private sectors, and serving as faculty in public and private academic institutions. Aristotelis was born in Athens and graduated in 1998 with a professional diploma in architecture and engineering from the National Technical University of Athens. He got his master's in architecture from Yale University at the School of Architecture in 2000. And at the same time, while he was here, he enrolled in a parallel 2-year-long theatrical set design studio at the Yale School of Drama. So a real Yale here. Okay, Aristotelis is currently Associate Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the Department of Architecture at the University of Ioannina in Greece. He's also currently the Fulbright Visiting Fellow at the Yale School of Architecture. He has served as a guest juror at multiple architecture schools, including the University of Cyprus and the University of Nicosia. He has taught as full-time faculty at the Savannah College of Arts and Design, the School of Building Arts, and also at the Frederick University in Nicosia and Cyprus, and as an adjunct professor at the University of Patras in Greece. He has written extensively in English and Greek on diverse topics in urbanism and architecture under historical, theoretical, and critical perspectives. As we will see today, one of them, the autobiographical perspective, focusing also on the regional as well as the international level. His diverse research topics have focused on the workplace cultures, and business environments, on the study of the genre of autobiography in the context of architecture, and on the examination of urbanism as a realm of metaphysics. He has also published extensively, and you can find his articles in magazines, books, and periodicals in international and Greek publications. So without more delay, I want to welcome Aris to today's talk. And Ari, I hand over the digital floor to you.
Thank you, George. It's a great honor to be part of your lecture series and to be here with you. And it's a great challenge, of course, an honor to talk about the Parthenon. And I think it's a kind of a lifelong pursuit for me, but perhaps for many architects. I should share my screen, I guess, first. Okay. Does it show everything's good in terms of sound and the image? Can you hear me? I don't think I can hear you, but let me kind of stop sharing to see if I...
No, we can hear you, Aris. Go ahead.
Okay, now I can. Okay, that's fine. Good. It's a great challenge to talk about all these names at once. So I'll have to move quite fast between each personality, and I will explain actually the title as we go, because it is really something that comes out of the dialogue that is built between them, not directly but intellectually. So the first thing that I want to note is that we're talking about the Parthenon and the Acropolis of Athens specifically, and not really about any kind of conglomeration of buildings on natural edge on a cliff. This is, for example, Villa Jovis by the Emperor Tiberius, and something like that. We're absolutely not talking about this. This has not a relevant effect for architects or thinkers. We're not actually talking about any temple. We're talking again specifically about the Parthenon. For example, this is the temple of Hephaestus, the so-called Theseion, which is not long after the Parthenon. It's a Doric temple. It's in perfect condition, so one can grasp what this is all about much easier. But all of the visitors have been to this temple, but none of them really speak much about it. They focus on the Parthenon. So I want to make this clear. I mean, it's not easy to understand why immediately. It's a constant procedure of questioning that, but it's significant to have in mind. If we go directly into our travelers, Sigmund Freud goes to the Acropolis in 1904 at the age of 48, and he has been trying with his brother to have a short vacation in Greece. Apparently, they were planning to go to Corfu, and they rescheduled everything to go to the Parthenon while this was not the plan. Freud is a philhellene. He's reading the classics continuously. He's in dialogue intellectually with the Greek heritage of letters. He is collecting antiquities in his office. And this visit is absolutely something that he knew that he wanted to do, and particularly that he was prepared for. But after the visit, he doesn't talk about it at all. And it takes another 32 years. At the age of 80, he writes a letter to his dear friend and intellectual partner, Romain Rolland, a French writer who he is building up a relation, was really a correspondent and really an intellectual who he shares ideas with after the failure of more such relationships earlier. And so the question is, how come that letter comes up 32 years later and is published the year after it is written? And I'll get back to that. In 1911, Le Corbusier, who's much younger, half the age of Sigmund Freud, he goes also to Athens. He's visiting the rock of the Acropolis after a long, more than 6 month long journey, the Voyage d'Orient, as it's called, where he went through the Balkans from Berlin to Constantinople, spent time there, went to Mount Athos, apparently, a very difficult destination, especially for a non-Orthodox Christian. Cathar, in this way, actually, it's like heresy for Catholics. Catholics were butchered at some point in the Middle Ages by the Catholics. So Le Corbusier manages to go to Mount Athos, spends time there, and then he goes by boat to Athens at the time where the pandemic that we have today was nothing but kind of a light situation, as they had cholera, they had to quarantine, they had many other epidemics, and altogether it was not a time easy to travel. So Le Corbusier goes there, having talked about architecture before in a negative way when we're talking about neoclassical architecture or eclecticist or historically referenced architecture. So he's really against the classical, but he has not really studied the Greek culture or the Parthenon. And then he gets a kind of a shock effect on the rock of the Acropolis, and he immediately sends letters. He incessantly gets back to his experience with books and talks and publications. But the two have never really met, have never really been in dialogue. Their only latent link is surrealism, meaning the movement in the arts that, of course, sought Freud's acceptance. And on the other hand, Le Corbusier only has been discussed as being a surrealist in a way. Some of his projects have such qualities. Then if we go into what their lives was, Sigmund Freud office in Vienna is what later has been discussed as an active container, an active room. The references to Eastern and Oriental cultures is apparent. There is a situation of the Mirage d'Orient. We see Fayums, we see antiquities, we see the fabrics and the psychoanalytic chaise longue here, which is very much related to what Le Corbusier confronted in his stay in Constantinople. Here we see a much debated image where he's dressed as a salon with his traveler and companion, Auguste Klipstein. Back then, he didn't even have the name Le Corbusier. He was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret. And we can say that the background is the same in the two images almost, right? Or even further, the arrangement, the improvised organization of the chaise longue for the psychoanalytic couch is absolutely relevant to the chaise longue that a bit later Le Corbusier with Pierre Jeanneret and Charlotte Brillant design. And even the bathroom at the major project by Le Corbusier has this exact posture, which is surprising in a very coldness of tiling and in a permanent scheme that is there in an open bathroom enjoyed throughout the house. Of course, we can easily make a connection to the anaklindron, the seated, the posture at the Greek symposia in the kline, which is in chaise longue par excellence, right? And so going back to the fact of the horror vacuum that we may recognize in Sigmund Freud's arrangement in his office with his antiquities and books, we can see that that's again trace of a non-Western presence and mindset. And that, of course, has to do, easily can be connected to many images that are even from rural houses here. Apparently, is one from northern Greece and Western Macedonia. And this approach, this very expressive approach of Freud towards his subject, really is connected to the autobiography, to the realm of autobiography. Here's his book, an autobiographical study, really a major gesture, showing that he is thinking of his subject in an autobiographical way throughout, and that psychoanalysis is absolutely about autobiography. And in that way, such a letter comes out in the Almanac of Psychoanalysis in 1937, which is the letter to Romain Rolland for the Acropolis. Now, if we see why would ever an 80-year-old remember such an old experience, and that's not discussed in the meantime, we need to have in mind that that was a very tough time, right? His books were already burned by the Nazis. His health was deteriorating. He had cancer for 10 years and had more than 10 surgeries, perhaps. He actually had to carry a metallic insert in his mouth. He had to flee eventually and very soon Vienna. He had to withdraw from the Psychoanalytic Society, a very controversial issue. And he finds the courage during Romain Rolland's birthday to write a letter to him describing something that has nothing to do with Romain Rolland. Of course, the interpretations are numerous. I'm not going to go into detail. What I want to focus on very briefly is the fact that Freud wants to discuss something with his friend that is exposing him autobiographically. And through that, he is exploring a situation of abnormality, let's say, in the way his psyche works. And I prefer the term psyche than mind. And specifically, if we go about what he wrote, is the title was initially Unglaube of the Acropolis, which was almost like disbelief in German of the Acropolis. Then it changes into Erinnerungsstörung of the Acropolis, which is a disturbance of memory on the Acropolis. So in English translation. And there he discusses his excitement, of course, to be at the rock of the Acropolis, Freud confronting the Parthenon, but the sense of disbelief, the absolute amazement, and he embodies a series of other terms that have to do with the alienation, with the realization, which is Entfremdungsgefühl in German, making an emphasis to the fact that his presence there is too good to be true, and that's overwhelming. So it's a discussion of incredulity. And again, the unglaublich in German, Unglaube is incredulity, unglaublich is the incredible, is in relation to also what George is doing, the feeling of somebody who has won. He actually brings that example. If you win in being an athlete and get a good position during your sport, there the feeling would be a total excitement, would be a feeling of derealization, or what you are happy, but at the same time something else is occurring. So what I want to emphasize also is that at no point he kind of questions Parthenon. He adores the Parthenon. He's ready for it. Of course, there is, again, many interpretation of the Oedipal phenomenon. For many researchers, the Parthenon can be male or phallic symbol. It can be female phallic symbol, which is bizarre, but it's apparently studied a lot. Or it is something that is to be rejected, or something that's to be loved. But my position here is that, because I need to move fast to that, is that Freud is absolutely in awe with the monument, and that, of course, he has his mind in identifying all these lateral occurrences in the mind, these disturbances, but that doesn't at any point bring down his relationship to the Parthenon. So if we move to Le Corbusier, he wrote very soon in the Manifesto of Modern Architecture, as it's called, Vers une Architecture, Toward an Architecture, and he devotes a chapter on the Parthenon, while he went there not knowing much and thinking that, you know, classicism is not something that's going to be embodied within modernism. Apparently, it is. And he writes again in the Almanac, d'Architecture Moderne, a couple of years later. And he keeps on writing, and there's many such references, and many researchers have done a lot of work in documenting all these references. But my focus here is as a detail. The fact that the title of the chapter for the Parthenon is called Pure Création de l'Esprit in French. In English, it's translated Pure Creation of the Mind, which is similar to Freud's emphasis on psychoanalysis, which comes out in the Anglo-Saxonic world as a theory of the mind. So there's a question there, maybe for another conversation, about the relation of the mind to the spirit. And this is continuous. Again, the emphasis on the Spirit Nouveau is very clear, covers of the magazine. And the fact that we have to have in mind that psyche is different than spirit, and that the two personalities have made the clear choices in terms used. Psyche is the Greek word, and spirit, esprit, comes again from another Greek word, which is pneo. So we know from English, pneumatic, right? Has to do with breathing in. And we have many words that have the same root than spirit, which is inspire, or expire, which is exhale. And aspire, conspire is just examples. But what is significant to have in mind is that the psyche is something that is lesser in relation to the spirit, because the spirit is more of a general notion that can be shared. The psyche is very personal. It's, and again, psyche is what, and I'll explain that. Psyche is what we may call as cold expiration, the last breath. The last breath comes out cold and is the moment that someone leaves this world. And therefore, psyche is the spirit embodied. In other words, might be discussed as enshrined, but is the embodiment of the spirit. And psyche is the personified spirit post-mortem. So the psyche belongs to one person. The spirit is something broader. In that sense only, it's greater, right? These are thoughts just to keep in mind, actually. But what is significant to say that this talk really is a kind of experimenting with the limits of reason, because one of the significant expressions that Robert Stern has used to discuss Vincent Scully, the Yale historian, is that Professor Scully made the battle for the soul of modern architecture seem like a conversation among reasonable people. So we are here really discussing something that is between madness and sanity, between the sane and the insane. And again, Scully, the historian, really was talking about metaphysics, about another term similar, the soul. And of course, what Robert Stern here emphasizes is that this endeavor to talk about these aspects is spanning surrealism, is something that one has to really play with in order to accept, because it's on the limits of reason, right? So please keep that in mind as we go on in this talk. Of course, the entire process of working with the Parthenon for Le Corbusier is a debate between conquering what is actually embodied in the Parthenon, which is the ineffable, and of course the pure. Of course, the term purism that comes out of this perhaps visit is one of the strongest gestures in modern architecture. And apparently Le Corbusier spends on the rock of the Acropolis 21 days or 22, 3 weeks more or less, going back like a lover to his object of desire for 21 days. And it's not a time easy to do this. It's a huge challenge in all aspects. And so there is an expression at the end of these 21 days that he talks about the Parthenon as a corpse. Perhaps it's inevitable to discuss, to kill the monument of desire, right? The object of desire, in order to move on in life. So this is kind of the diptych of Eros versus Thanatos. Yet that expression is deleted when the manuscript of the trip and the Voyage d'Orient comes to publication, which is after his own death, which is apparently also very moving. So there is a moment of disbelief or getting enough of it, and a moment of Entfremdungsgefühl, of alienation. But before reaching that, we have 21 days of touching, studying, working with the Parthenon, endless sketching, photographing and moving around the monument and around Athens also to sketch from a distance the Acropolis and the Parthenon. And the sketches are numerous, and I would just like to read a short sentence by another scholar who just describing the obvious, but the obvious has very bizarre later consequences. The Parthenon, I read, is in a silhouette against the horizon, bounded by the mountains and the sea, the powerful intuition of basic geometric relationship of temporal surroundings. So it's very significant to note here the lines of the horizon and how the landscape comes into the picture, and that is not obvious. And the hierarchy of what happens in the landscape is absolutely significant to see where actually Le Corbusier misread potentially the monument. And I will go first to show you what the relation is with actually his work. This is Villa Savoye, which is apparently one of the masterpieces of Le Corbusier. I'm going to show you, and since we're not mostly architects, how it's connected to the Parthenon experience. Of course, this is the frieze as it is displayed in the Parthenon Museum by Bernard Tschumi in Athens. It's a strip, right? It's a continuous ribbon, which is apparently very close to what Le Corbusier does with one of the main points of main expressions of modern architecture, the strip window in the Villa Savoye. If at the Parthenon, the frieze is the evidence of human life, it's the procession of the Panathemia. In the Villa Savoye, it is the animation of real life and the exposure to the outside, emphasized with this specific view. And a more bourgeois approach of what the frieze is like is here in this 1868 painting, where Phidias shows in a Western kind of approach of what would be happening in ancient Greece, the frieze to his fellows and friends and to Pericles. And the continuous frieze is significant for the Athenians, right? Because it portrays Athenians. It's the only presence of non-divine expression here. All the rest of the sculpture is gods. So if we take the front view of the Parthenon, I'm gonna do a very violent collage to show you how this goes into recreating the Villa Savoye. If we enlarge the metopy and we can entablature and we move it lower, it comes closer, and we remove the pediment, it comes closer to what Le Corbusier is aiming for. If we thin out the columns as well, and if we impose the section of the rock of the Acropolis onto the Parthenon, we get something like that. So we have like a Parthenon that contains the rock of the Acropolis, and the roof level, the Toit Jardin, the roof garden for the moderns, is actually the Acropolis. So this is actually what I read myself. Many have talked about the systematization of modern architecture as corresponding with the systematization of the classical orders. But here is like really moving back and forth from the Parthenon, to the Villa Savoy. And if we take the fact that proceeding to the Parthenon is kind of a ramping up, it's kind of a situation of going uphill and emphasized here with this rough line, then we can imagine that this procession is within the Villa Savoy, and truly the sections to the right of the villa that contains a ramp that takes you to the roof level is exactly expressing that. Of course, the other simulation of the Acropolis is the new Acropolis Museum by Bernaccioni, where it contains a ramp where the displays of the foot of the hill, the as we say in Greece, is exhibited. So it's a ramp itself as well, and emphasizes this relation to Villa Savoy and the ascending of the hill of the Acropolis. Here is the plan of the Parthenon with the plan of the Villa Savoy in scale, and actually the 5 columns, 5 by 5, the square shape of the plan can be related to the 5 columns out of the 8 of the short facade of the Parthenon. Actually, the dimension between columns, the distancing is exactly the same, and we can realize that the fact that there's this curve that has to do with the presence of the car and other insistence of Le Corbusier. He is also revealing second row of columns as a pronaos, as we see in the Parthenon, and getting the 2 facades in scale, like the square side of Villa Savoy to the short side of the Parthenon. We see more, we can read more, that the sikos, the main prism of the temple, is existing in the Villa Savoy in the ground floor plan, which is this. And actually, we can claim that it's sliced in the monument in that way, taking away the left side, which was the treasury, and keeping the sacred side, the sanctuary, to the right for Athena. Of course, it was inaccessible. It was a sacred locus of the priestesses, the virgin priestesses, and that emphasizes a kind of sacredness in Le Corbusier's building. And if we actually even compare the section at that point of the Parthenon, this is a Schiller drawing, to the facade of the opposite side, which is questionable. Many people have talked about the Villa Savoy, but not about that facade. That is really like a T shape, exactly like a T shape is the section of the Parthenon. It's 2-tiered in section, 2 levels, in a similar way. Then the issue of sacredness within the Villa Savoy, that emphasizes the term Esprit Nouveau, is further showcased with this lavabo or the sink, the kind of basin that reminds of a Catholic church. So as you enter the ground floor, you wash your hands in this freestanding sink, and then you proceed into taking on the ramp or the stair. In greater size buildings, like here we see drawing a sketch, chalk of the Unité d'Habitation. Le Corbusier actually follows the same principle, a rough and very violent collage by me, showing that the principles are almost similar to adding more floors, of course, between the Villa Savoy and the Unité. This is an aerial photograph of the building that could have been or was intended to be endless in length, as like a never infinite line, never ending building, as he has shown in Villera Diez. And the buildings that are on the roof become a different landscape. We can see a different architecture displayed on the roof. It's a new ground level. This is a photo of individual entities that are really somehow becoming a reproduction of the rock of the Acropolis with the outline of the landscape. This contemporary city is sliced off, however, with its parapets, and there is a kindergarten on the roof rather than on the ground, so the kids are abducted for the natural soil to exist and grow and get nurtured on the rooftop, which is not something that is very secondary. He actually published a book, Le Martinel, at the nursery schools, specifically showcasing and analyzing how that works as an educational almost system, right? And we read him. The massive parapet at the top of the Unité is a little less than 5.5 feet, 1.60 meters. It protects and also screens out the mediocre reality of the down-to-earth, leaving only the sipping horizon, the mountains and the sea visible. I too dwelt in Arcadia. 10 years from now, this is what the graduates of our nursery school will be saying. So he is really into forming a new generation of a new man. Of course, this has to do a lot with what Le Corbusier has been discussing with Sikelianos some time ago in the 20s about the Delphic festivals that Sikelianos and Eva Palmer actually were planning, and they were thinking about doing something like that beyond Delphi, perhaps in France. It never happened, but Le Corbusier does it. He creates these festivals on the rooftop of his building, showing the significance of this rooftop as a new Acropolis. And he insists on that. He calls that Homeric. And we read again another scholar on this, that the multiple objects figures reinvent the ancient temple precinct through the rewriting of the program vis-a-vis Le Corbusier, political, social, and personal bodily affinities, and thus inscribe upon the roof garden a modern Corbusian pantheism with its own rituals and processions, including annual fairs with Arcadian dances performed by the children of the Unité. And this is actually a representation by Le Corbusier where he takes, and the floating rooftop of the building becomes a new landscape. It's almost, this is the intention of making the building. And there's nothing mediocre below. There's not the presence of humans. It's only the landscape in the horizon. This landscape is what, of course, he drew and drew and drew over again, reaching atop of the various hills of Athens. And he's perhaps, in his interpretation, he's shown by his idea that the Parthenon is the single thought, this singular expression, the one-liner, which is, again, something that might be problematic, as I will show you. What is significant, and actually Scully points out, is that also Le Corbusier, he uses Le Corbusier to say that, is that Le Corbusier discusses the inescapability of the fact of presence of the monument. So the presence and the fact that it is there, something, of course, we saw Freud having an issue with, is perhaps, and also as Scully phrases it, the presence of the embodied divinity. So for Greeks, the physical presence of the monument was the physical existence of the gods. And in that way, we can understand maybe the fact that even Scully says that people around you, when you are on the rock of the Acropolis, just talk to themselves and say, I can't take it in, I can't take it in. That they are overwhelmed because they are exposed to something that is superhuman almost, right? And this issue of the presence of divinity within the built form is something that is discontinued in later expressions that look like Parthenons, like Roman architecture. Of course, Le Corbusier insists on this deletion of the city below. This is the Bastigui Salon and roof terrace. Bastigui, the famous Argentinian playboy who commissioned Le Corbusier to create his penthouse in Paris. Le Corbusier creates this parapet, which is amazing in chopping off the city below and keeping only a hint, like the Arc de Triomphe, and having this surrealist, of course, open-air salon. And in all photographs, this is shown, that you don't want the city below. And this expresses really what Le Corbusier explicitly has written about, the fact that he wants to delete the city. He can't communicate with the city. He doesn't want to relate to the city, and he wants to relate to something beyond. This is perhaps the shock of the sacredness of the Parthenon that has been absorbed so greatly that he's been X-rayed again for 21 days by that beaming energy. And you can see even the relation. This is a drawing after the photographs, later than the visit to the Acropolis. Again, this sweeping view that slices off the close by and keeps the horizon. And here is perhaps where we get into architects having their very subjective interpretations and reflecting themselves. Le Corbusier was very open to read the Parthenon. When Louis Kahn here in the photograph visits Greece and he sketches, he's a very different personality, not much talkative, not very expressive, very Spartan in a way. And I am reading what Scully writes about his visits. The emotional response to ancient ruins studied in school, previously visiting in 1929, is very significant for his later work. Here is a depiction of the Rock of the Acropolis by Louis Kahn, especially affected by the way the Mediterranean light played upon the haunting, silent, and monumental form. And actually, haunting and silent to me, they don't talk about the monumental forms, talk about Kahn, his personality, and his reception of the ancient monument. So he looks like a haunted person oftentimes, if you would study him more, and very silent. He doesn't talk much. So introversion, heaviness, and a love for the archaic. He has expressed that he didn't really enjoy the classical rhythms as much as the archaic. He wants heaviness. He wants that presence of the light and the shadow and this kind of very orange and reddish tones that have to do almost with fire. And we have to have in mind that this is really part of the experience of being on the Rock of the Acropolis. It's not always as pleasant. I mean, you are there and the rock is ruthless and the heat and the sun reflecting and you're exposed to the elements and you have, of course, the sweeping views, but truly the colors are part of the image. Here is a painting that demonstrates that, and of course it was a colored temple in the ancient years. Plus the fact that his own personal story, Kahn had severe burns in his face and deep scars that he wouldn't talk about. And the story goes that when he was a 3-year-old kid, he was so seduced by the fire of burning coal that he took some of the coal in his apron and that caught on fire and burned his face. So he has a serious love or passion for light and for light that is strong and orangey in color. The sunset hitting the Parthenon is really that very strong experience. And he moves going to Corinth or Delphi and emphasize that too. But then we reach a point where modernism, in relation to the deletion or denial and negation of the city, has turned over the situation. Here's New Haven, we know well here, before the urban renewal efforts and after the urban renewal efforts. So highways and mega objects reach the town. One of them in this photograph exists, the Knights of Columbus, and the other one has been demolished. Incredible such one-liners invade the modern city. And actually himself, Scully writes very negatively. Le Corbusier and Wright, I'm reading, and all the particular giants of the Bauhaus are the true villains. The mafia architects are their proper sons. Modern architecture at its best is even more anomalous than at its worst. He's actually using a Greek word, anomalous. And he's very upset, obviously, right? Because this tendency, I'm cutting short, of course, because reaching the end, the turn that the city has taken with modern architecture is devastating, as we know in America, as much as in the rest of the world. Scully thinks that even though there are successes within the scale of a singular building in Kahn or in Le Corbusier, the effects, the collective effects of modernism are appalling. So it's very significant to see what he's saying. Modern architecture tends to excite the Faustian and empty appetites of the artist's ego rather than reveal an artist's vision. So he talks about the eye. And apparently one of the chapters in Le Corbusier's book is Eyes That Cannot See. In the book Toward an Architecture, the Manifesto of Modern Architecture, he kind of confesses somehow, he's talking about other eyes that don't see, but apparently he doesn't see eventually, and it would be very lengthy to explain the whole story, how this failure occurs. But what Scully concludes with this is, beware, the ultimate promise of modern architecture is collective sightlessness of the species, for the species. Blindness is the fruit of design. So it's about the eye. It's between vision that should have been and blindness that we have resulted to. And that kind of signifies the problem. It's like, what do we do with modern architecture in relation to the city? And perhaps is the Parthenon the problem? And we have someone very important, Colin Rowe, who says yes. Apparently in the book Collage City, this is the strongest page. To the left is the plan of the Parthenon and the sacred rock of the Acropolis. To the right is the imperial fora, the emperor's courtyards and premises. To the left is the object, the single buildings in a void that is not perhaps defined as much. To the right, you could fit the objects of the left drawing to the right drawing in the courtyards. So Colin Rowe goes on to compare a goddess, the god's realm, of course, that can be something with issues, to the emperor's premises, which again, in another case, has anything to do with the city, but the right is a kind of an abstraction of an archetype of the city, which means that there are buildings in close adjacency and very defined voids. So while Colin Rowe and Fred Cotter don't talk at all about the Parthenon elsewhere in the book, they condemn the Parthenon for the failure of the modern city because of the readings of the Parthenon by Le Corbusier primarily, and that whole culture that has risen through it. So what would that take us to? I mean, this is the Ottoman city on the rock of the Acropolis, where the monuments are lost between small, anonymous, vernacular, non-architectural edifices. Or this is again the plan of the rock of the Acropolis in the Ottoman years, and it's lost within a city. And another depiction of the inhabited monument somehow in a grid, a fabric of urban. Or if you take out the vernacular, if you go to high architecture, here is the palace of supposedly the king of Greece, the German, of course, from Bayern, from Bavaria. And this is a model in showcasing what would have happened if on the Parthenon would have the palace of the Greek monarch would have been built, which is again questionable if that is another option, and if that would result in something more acceptable and answer the problems of the modern city. But what I'm posing and closing this presentation here is the work again by Vincent Scully, who went to Greece, to Magna Graecia, to Italy, southern Italy, and to Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, documenting numerous occasions of temples and composing that book, The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods, Greek Sacred Architecture. Actually, Scully first saw from naval, he was serving in the Second World War and saw first in Paestum temples from a distance from the sea, and that image was so impressed, and he went back eventually to study this in a detail that I think no one else has. And his thesis has to do with the issues that deeply concern us today, which is environmental complications and the relation of the human body to the environment, which here he shows through extensive and exhaustive photographic sessions that the monuments are not objects. They are expressions within the landscape, and that the landscapes are sacred, and that sacredness is that informs the presence of the built form, that in some cases doesn't even need to be there, and it doesn't exist actually in Greek religious sites, and that the divinity of the landscape is significant. It has been significant. There are sacred mountains in Greece, and that whole project becomes kind of a landscape manifesto that we so much would need today to answer these questions that I attempted to pose. And so to give just a very brief and last example of what Scully says is, again, when you enter the Propylaea in Athens from the left here, and you move to visit the Parthenon, the scheme of movement is such that you first see the diagonal between the buildings, the Erechtheion and the Parthenon, and that frames sacred mountains in the horizon, and that's the end of your visual spectrum. And then you have to turn around almost 180 degrees to get into the main space, this sanctuary of the goddess Athena, turning just at the sanctuary of Zeus that is outside. And that concept of a landscape is something that we would question ourselves. Have we seen it in architecture so far? Has anybody tried out? And this is the images that, the photographs that document this 90-degree turnaround that is imposed upon the body while visiting the Rock of the Acropolis. Sergei Eisenstein has written about it. Choisy, a century before him, has again tried to discuss that, but it's not possible to cover this. So the first view from the Propylaea to the two monuments is this perspective that also Doxiadis has tried to analyze. The mountain is seen as the end. It's kind of a wall down there. And then you turn around and you see the opposite axis, the sea. And that is the one-liner, perhaps, that Le Corbusier has discussed. And perhaps it's also a one-liner, but it's not the only gesture that Pericles wanted to express the victory against the Persians through the building of this monument and the presence of Athena, of goddess Athena, as a real physical presence within the city that is protected by her. If I give an example that shows that in modern architecture is a very, very well-known building, is the Barcelona Pavilion, which is apparently a landscape. The Barcelona Pavilion, for those who are not architects, the plan is down. These gray areas, hatched areas are water. The model is above. And there is a final destination. You enter from the this red line. You have to turn around 180 degrees. There is a wall and water instead of the mountains of the sacred rock of the Acropolis to act in a similar way. And you turn around 180 degrees and you reach a sanctuary. There's a place where it is protected. It can be locked off, but it is open because there are walls that are not enclosed. And you reach the sanctuary by turning 180 degrees, exactly like you do in the Parthenon. So I'm going to leave you with that, explaining that this is an open project, inviting, I guess, everyone moved by it to think on it, because we need it, because it has to do with our presence in this world, with our relation to the environment. It has to do with our connection to the divine and the metaphysical, and has to do also with our everyday lives. So I would like to thank you for your patience today.
Hira, if you could activate my screen again. So there is no question yet, Ari, so I will pose the first question. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
I closed the presentation though.
Okay, I mean, you don't need to see me as long as you can hear me. So I want to pose it's a kind of two-fold question. One has to do with the nature of the building as it is today, right? It is a building in ruin. And then the other question has to do with your angle of reading a lot of these responses to the Parthenon through autobiography. So one of, I'll start with the second part. How far do you think that these scholars or thinkers or architects are thinking also through their national classicisms, specifically for the Germans and the high idealism that they invested into ancient Greece? I'm just going to read two lines from Humboldt from early 19th century. For us, the Greeks step out of the circle of history. If every part of history enriches us with its human wisdom and human experience, then from the Greeks, we take something more than earthly, something almost godlike. So with this in mind, Freud's refusal to acknowledge that he is there, or rather this sense of wonder that he is there, makes sense also through this narrative that develops and becomes so prominent in German thought all the way through the Nazi period. And so my question is, is there a narrative of national classicisms that have to do with France, have to do with Germany, and also to the United States with Scully? But my other question has to do with the realities of the building today, that every visit to the Acropolis is an exercise in imagination. Many people go there not actually having an image of what the Parthenon looked like, and which is why I posted as my background the Nashville Acropolis. It wasn't just a joke. I think it was a very fulfilling experience to see even a replica of the building fully reconstructed. Yes, it is not marble, and yes, some of the sculpture is really not finely carved, but it does give you a really good sense of how the buildings and its solidity stood on the Parthenon, right? In your imagination, you can imagine how it might have looked on the rock, because in Nashville it's on a flat surface. But this is what I'm kind of thinking. Maybe the absence of the complete building stimulates this kind of creative and even divine inspiration approach that you get from these visitors. That is precisely because we cannot see. Scully says eyes that don't see, right? But the truth is, when we go to the Acropolis, we don't really see the Acropolis anymore. We still cannot see it. We see just the remnants of it. So are these reactions partly explained by the physicality of our experience rather than these metaphysical questions that they raise? Is my question. Isn't it inevitable that a building like the Parthenon would have to be an imagined one? It would have to be one that disturbs the reality we see, because the reality we see is not the Parthenon as we understand it today. The way we talk about the Parthenon is not about those buildings, about those remnants, right?
Yeah, it's more challenging to have the two questions together. If I start with the first one.
Start with the national.
Because the last one, there was a detail that I wanted to kind of ask you to clarify about the perception.
The second one.
But for the second one, but let's keep from this first one. I mean, what is a kind of a parallel discussion in this address to the Parthenon nowadays is, of course, has to do with a postmodern reality as well, like which is sometimes asking for the loss of meaning. There's no real meaning, but you assign meaning in such scenarios. Perhaps many people might have been tempted to discuss the Parthenon in that way, that it's like anything else in the postmodern world. you assign meaning, and meaning is questionable. And of course, if the Parthenon is misunderstood, and it's misunderstood as a symbol of Westernness, and Westernness has its issues, then we get reaching other situations. But I think that what is the most significant aspect of the visits and is the physicality of the Parthenon. And that's more likely going to the second question, so I'll keep it aside. But the kind of denial of the significance of the physicality, if we take that as the national kind of questioning because of Germanic or French approaches, we have suffered from that. It's really existing. That's why I'm bringing up the projective disturbances as an issue, is that we project ourselves, and the Parthenon is generating disturbances and misinterpretations, because if I give you my personal opinion, the physicality, the embodiment of the presence of the God is something that most of the visitors have talked about. I mean, these people that we're talking about here, with the exception of Kahn, who draws rather than refer in detail to the Acropolis, talk about that, right? So, and that Scully brings it as a major aspect of how you differentiate the Roman architecture from Greek architecture. That Greek architecture is about the body and the embodiment of the gods, and that actually he says that, and it's critical that the last such embodiment is the Parthenon, and then it is the representation of the gods, and that's why it ends up being secular and not really a sacred space, and that makes a huge difference in reality. So there is the Parthenon envy in many ways that we can see even traces of that in the visits of Le Corbusier and Freud. But on the other hand, we're talking about personalities who really embraced this, like kind of overwhelmed and totally absorbed the significance of the monument. So I think that there are such discussions that we can hold regarding the political approaches, the more collective. But in this case, I think that the unconscious jumps in of really unique personalities that have ways to to sense this exposure to the uniqueness of the Acropolis, and that is coming to the front and taking over any kind of other narratives. Of course, many of the scholars studying the visits of each, Freud and Le Corbusier, have tried to get there and to discuss, the rejection of the monument, or the death of the monument, or the denial, and so on. But I think that is the greatest lesson, since we're talking about autobiography, is that at 80 years old, threatened by the disintegration of the exterior world and of his bodily presence, Freud reaches to the Parthenon this many years ago, a visit that he brings up to discuss, perhaps for one of the few times in his life, more as a human person, as a person who manages to think and is not really washed away by realities and physicality, the deterioration of our presence in this world, the war and health.
Right. There is a question that is along the same lines as what we have been discussing. I'll read it out. It's from Nikos Chrysidis, and the question goes like this. Speaking about Jerusalem, Mark Twain observed that everyone finds in Jerusalem what they're looking for. Could we say the same about the Acropolis? Given also the religious undercurrents in Freud's approach to the Acropolis and the correspondence with Roman Roland. Is this building entirely colonizable, is the question, by anyone who goes there?
I guess so. I think in a way I answered this because the sensitive and the moment of doubt in this question is like, what do actually people see there? And they all see what they want. And it's again, the postmodern approach that sees whatever you want and there's nothing there. I mean, that's why I think I responded to that, and I disagree entirely with that. Of course, we are. Everyone is allowed to see what they would like to and discuss that, but in this case, it's very clear that there is content that is overbearing, perhaps, and there's content that it's not singular in its interpretation, but it's not to be denied. So I would think that that doesn't go with any historic site. And of course, as you mentioned, to move on to the other aspect in relation to what you say, the question posed is that the Parthenon is not an object, right? So if you take it and build it anywhere, in the New York Stock Exchange, in Nashville, or you build it in Madeleine in Paris, it has nothing to do with it. For Scully, and I really follow that, and that kind of is a salvation for us in these dilemmas. Is we're not talking about an object, we're talking about a divine presence, if that's between insanity and sanity, right? Because all these thinkers are kind of juggling between this impossibility realm. And it's a landscape. I mean, the fact that you are confronting the Parthenon on a diagonal, and the retaining wall is in a diagonal in relation to the Philopappou Hill, and that you approach that in an angle, and there is the sacred horns at the back, as Scully says. There is an entire landscape that cannot be taken away, and that landscape is enriched by the presence of the ancient Greeks' pagan faith, and in that way, that is not something that you can just replicate successfully, and it's a serious concern.
There is another comment that I'd like to read out, and I want to apologize for my disappearance from the Parthenon in my screen, but I think the Parthenon is better than me in front of it, so we'll stick with that. The question, it's not a question, it's a reference to a book discussing the Parthenon and Freud's visit. The comment is from Angelos Evangelidis, and he points out that Stathis Vourvouris in his book Dream Nation wrote about this particular incident and calls it the colonization of the ideal. I think we can take that phrase and kind of read it in two ways too, how at least the Germans colonized the ideal as their own, and by extension, anything that they could call ideal, including the Parthenon, but also how the ideal colonizes Greece. Because in many of these discussions, the fact that this building is in a modern state with its own vibrant urban environment surrounding it is entirely erased from these narratives. The eyes don't see it, right? So there is an absence of the physicality of Athens in many of these narratives, and sometimes an erasure of Athens. So I don't know if you have anything to say about this question of colonization, and I'll finish my comment with perhaps the most sober comment I've ever heard about the visit to the Acropolis. This is from a relative of a friend of mine from Syria, and this relative who had gone to the Acropolis said to me, I was not impressed by the Acropolis. I have seen better things in Petra or the Middle East. And of course, in the Middle East, there are many, many Greek and Roman buildings that are much better preserved than the Parthenon, right? So I liked her response because it was so so non-adulterated by the ideologies that these thinkers bring to the building, right? That make it a truly exceptional building, at least in European history. And I mean that in the context of the exceptionality of every nationalism that claims that each nation is, each one and only one is exceptional. But I think the Parthenon in the history of European history has an exceptional place. No other building or monument in Europe can be claimed by everyone. The building itself doesn't claim anything, but it is a building that is constantly being claimed by others. So maybe with that, answer this question of what exactly are we colonizing? is also modern Greek colonized by the prestige and aura of this building? Is it there to also, in many ways, remind us of how fallen we are as a people compared to this sublime, absence that is haunting the city from on top? Or maybe some commentary on this, and link it maybe to Nikos's question about the religiosity of Freud in this building, in his reading of this building.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if that's too many questions again.
Yeah. No, it's not an easy task, but it's such a provocative conversation. Of course, the Germanic. I do have a serious issue with the Germanic interpretations of the Greeks, right? Because of course, and the first thing before I forget is the first two slides I went about specifying that because I knew that's going to come up. We're not talking about any kind of promontory or a kind of anything that's built on a rock and looks like ancient, right? So that's why I brought the example of the Theseum, so-called, it's a temple of Hephaestus, because it's an absolutely perfect condition. And yes, somebody would think that, perfect condition is better than worse condition, but it's not really, and that's also the ecological debate about do you rebuild like the American Archaeological School did with the Stoa of Attalos in the Agora of Athens, or do you keep the actual material? You try to kind of build it up. I think that we need to, in my view at least, it's absolutely significant to differentiate that we're talking about the Parthenon and we're talking about the physical presence of that specific landscape, right? And because it is a landscape, and in many ways, even Le Corbusier, even Scully, and many others, they don't talk about the propylia in the same way because it's more of a Roman presence and ever evolving. But the Germanic issue with, or the Western, because all Western cultures have absorbed the Parthenon. You see, in all countries, neoclassicism. I don't think what we read there is what there is. That's the question, and I think again it's a very lonely situation with Scully having read that, and kind of me insisting perhaps about the presence of a divine landscape that makes a difference, that takes us away from replicating little cornices like I have behind me. And of course, that's great as well, but doesn't stop there. And the fact that the Greek culture has as much the rational combined with the paradoxical, the Apollonian with the Dionysiac, Nietzsche most likely is best talking about that. That doesn't mean that whoever understands half of it has grasped Greekness, right? Or can reproduce it successfully. And in that way, of course, I would differentiate Freud because he's Jewish. And he's, I would say, a blasphemous Jewish. He's kind of questionable, heretic, or he's not as religious in the traditional way. He's coming from a Germanic context, but and that also means a different, complete religious bringing up. His father was a merchant, which is also another issue that many discuss in relation to his brother Alexander, who goes with him, and he's a merchant picking up business of the father. And actually, the name was given by Freud, Alexander, as I read, and that has a long story about the relation of the two and the difference between the two. So it is a unique case, I think. And again, the key point for me is that meaning is not just a way of colonizing individually anything. We need to be able to read meaning where there is meaning before we kind of also project ourselves. Of course, we totally continue and fail. I mean, there is kind of a discussion that's brought to the realm of metaphysics. If the Parthenon is the presence of the divine, really embodied, right? Then we are not prepared to see that. more or less, we're going to fail to see that. That's why you see Scully saying that people on the rock of the Acropolis say, I can't take it in. Freud says, unglaublich, I can't believe it. Or a shock to the object goes back and returns and cannot have enough of it. And it absorbs it and kind of adopts it and steals it. And then he moves into kind of many different failures in kind of dragging over the archetype, as the presentation also showed. So it is an ever evolving attempt to approach the divine, and it's kind of an example of that. That's why it becomes enigmatic, as I presented in the blurb. Even Apostle St. Paul has written in the Corinthians that the presence of the divine in this world is enigmatic, and is also kind of like through a mirror. And Dobro, I'm not going to say it in Greek, but very few can understand it. So it's enigmatic and through reflections, and it's momentarily, it's kind of escaping. And of course, to confront divinity is a shocking experience that you might not even be prepared for it, because you have in mind that your daily errands are waiting for you, and you can't deal with that at all, which may be the reception of somebody, as you mentioned, from your friend from Syria, which is absolutely acceptable. Not every architect visiting the rock has written about it or managed to communicate with that. And in that way, it is kind of a measure that is perhaps missed because somebody is not prepared.
Mm-hmm. I have two last very short questions. Has any one of these thinkers written about the statue that would have been in the building? Because this rhetoric of the ineffable, of the unseeable, was in fact not an issue for the ancient Greeks. If anything, we have inherited from the ancient Greek culture is the permission and ability to represent the divine. This deviates from the other monotheistic religions, the other two, and also from Protestantism, right? So I'm wondering whether there is also that aspect that comes into the reading of the Parthenon, in that they choose to ignore the fact that the ancient worshippers would have been in the presence of this magnificent goddess in the building, in the statue.
Yeah, the kind of issue with that would be that there is a statue, but I'm not sure if it's visited, because it's a sacred, it's a sanctuary that is visited by the virgin priestesses.
No, the public would have been in there. The public could get in there, right? And of course, you can go in Nashville and see the whole thing again. It's well reconstructed, actually. But my last question: Scotland tried to do the same thing that Nashville did, but failed.
But I have something more.
Scotland, in Edinburgh, they tried to rebuild a Parthenon in the early 19th century, but stopped midway and never finished it. It now stands with, I don't know, maybe like 8 columns in one line. Has anyone kind of addressed that attempt in your readings of the Adventures of the Parthenon?
I think that what brings that into question is that, again, I think Scully is mentioning the Hercule Fontaine statue in Olympia, and also in Athens.
Zeus.
Zeus, yes, and Phidias. It's not something that I can recall from others, but there is the issue of dealing with the ruin or with the actual initial presence of the monument. And I think that it's kind of going both ways, is that the presence of what is there already is embodying what the initial temple carried. I mean, myself, in the way I perceive the monument being there, that's what touches me. And of course, it's a big question: how would it look like completed, and if there would be any objections about it. I've heard even very important people saying, "Oh my God, it would have been very ugly with all the colors and all the sculpture." I would hesitate to express an opinion, but I would think I would be very positive in seeing the whole thing, because seeing the part already convinces me.
Yes.
But really, the presence of ruins for architects is significant, and I think that specifically Louis Kahn is more touched by that. Perhaps the fact that you have a colonnade and a ribbon of beams connecting those is also a reading. Perhaps some people have talked about Le Corbusier, because the Sikos was extinct. We could take the stone and rebuild it and cut it because it was rectangular, unlike the columns. And in that way, maybe the open plan is something like that. You walk into an empty perimeter, and this vacant perimeter can be interpreted either in the postmodern way with the loss of meaning, or can be just enough that you can fall in love with it and depict it and talk about the ruin rather than the actual initial monument.
It's fascinating that you're bringing up the colors, because I'm noticing that the natural one does not have colors on the statues, but also that our aesthetic standards have been so ingrained in us since, I guess, the Enlightenment and even before, to think of these architectural marvels as white, as sort of divested of anything that may actually approach some sense of realism, in the sense that at least the Greeks, even though they were so stylized, colored the statues, with the color of skin, or something that brought them closer to a reality. And our modern sensibility is to entirely reject that as ugly, because it is unthinkably too close to reality, maybe. Also, I want to deviate from the medieval aesthetic of painting the statues, which I think probably the Renaissance was consciously trying to distance itself from. But, well, thank you for today's talk, Ari. There's no other there. Oh, there is another one. Sorry. There is another question. Maybe you can respond to it very quickly. This is all from Nikos Chrysidis. But isn't this really a result of the education of all these thinkers? Yes, pretty much. The classical education that the gymnasium would offer in the 19th century, from Russia to France and everywhere in between. Because Nikos and I are thinking along the same lines, that they're bringing in their sort of national education of what ancient Greek must have been or ought to have been, which is the question. Ought to have been is mostly what they're bringing to the Parthenon, rather than what must have been.
Yeah, I think an answer to that comes, and it's really, really a very significant issue. That's why it comes back, because it's really torturing us. It has to do a lot with misinterpreting the Greek heritage. Le Corbusier himself was an outcast. He was a misfit in the architectural world. He was not an architect. He was not educated in the Beaux-Arts tradition. He hated academicism. He didn't like anything neoclassic. He never was invited in the Beaux-Arts because he had no, again, degrees to, no certifications about being an architect. He was called the man of letters. So he goes there completely with his gut instinct and his desire to become an architect, and his immense personality that's continuously torturing us in architecture schools since then. We're talking about somebody who in his life would never have been part of such an environment. So I think the fact that he goes there completely unprepared and he gets kind of smashed by the presence of the Parthenon, and he remains true to that, hating academicism, hating the neoclassic, wanting deliberately to demolish the city of Haussmann in Paris to build his own crazy tower schemes. He still talked about the Parthenon. So there is a complete bizarre misinterpretation of the pure and that the Parthenon is standing for. But on the other hand, that's very genuine. It's very autobiographical in these cases, and I think that the most significant aspect of Freud's explanations and text is the fact that he has the courage at the age of 80, even 48, when he went to the Parthenon. He was a very established, recognized professor, kind of a pioneer on his discipline, and he didn't need any Parthenons. He didn't need to think of that at the age of 80. Yet his brain, his soul is so active that he wants to get there, because that's what he brings up as a prime example to talk about the response, and that feeling of elimination, of disbelief. So I think it's not an issue for, in this case, that's why I chose those also, to bring narratives that these people are really representing kind of a nationalist educational approach. Both are misfits in a way.
Thank you for this great and complicated talk on
and Scully is a misfit as well.
Scully, yes. In many ways, the Acropolis is a misfit because it's standing up there, staring down at everybody in Athens. But thank you so much for today's conversation. I think it was a wonderful and very rich topic, and I think we can continue our conversation privately, because I think there's many relevances to what I do, mostly in the Olympics, which is also a hot topic today. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and please join us in April to discuss more about Russia and Orthodoxy. And thank you, Ari, again. And thank you, Mira, for organizing everything today.